The day came when you stopped reaching out, and they stopped reaching out too. Now all that's left is silence, and it keeps pulling your mind into endless questions. You're wondering if they even noticed your absence, if they secretly miss you, or if this quiet distance is exactly what they wanted from the beginning. But what most people never realize is that mutual silence between you and an avoidant doesn't mean the story is over. In many ways, it's only just beginning. Beneath the lack of messages, calls, or conversations, something much deeper starts unfolding. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand what is really happening inside an avoidant's mind during this period, why their emotional experience changes as the silence continues, and how this stage becomes the moment that either pushes them toward genuine emotional growth or proves they were never capable of showing up in the relationship. Because in the end, the real question isn't who sends the first message, it's who is willing to change, and there are clear signs that reveal the answer. At this very moment, while the silence still feels unbearable to you, your avoidant partner is often experiencing something completely different from what you might expect. Instead of panic or regret, their first emotional reaction is usually relief. Once communication stops from both sides, their nervous system often interprets the absence of emotional demands as a return to safety. The pressure they felt to respond, explain themselves, stay emotionally available, or meet relationship expectations suddenly disappears. Attachment psychology explains that avoidant individuals commonly rely on what experts call deactivating strategies. Whenever emotional closeness begins to feel overwhelming, their brain reacts as though intimacy itself is a threat that needs to be escaped. So when no one is reaching out anymore, they finally experience a sense of emotional breathing room. For a while, the quiet actually feels comforting because the internal tension they've been carrying begins to fade. But this silence isn't like all the others they've experienced before. In the past, even if they pulled away, there was usually an unspoken certainty that you would eventually reconnect. Your messages gave them reassurance without requiring them to become emotionally vulnerable. They could keep their distance while still knowing they mattered to you. That predictable pattern gave them a feeling of control because they believed the relationship would remain available whenever they decided to return. This time, however, everything feels different. When you stop reaching out as well, that familiar sense of certainty slowly begins to disappear. The emotional safety they depended on starts slipping away, and the silence no longer feels completely comfortable. Relief was only temporary. It was never designed to last forever. What follows next catches many avoidants completely off guard, and it becomes the moment that exposes whether they truly wanted a real relationship or simply enjoyed the comfort of knowing you would always remain within reach. As more time passes, those early feelings of relief slowly transform into something much harder to ignore. First comes curiosity, as they begin noticing that nothing has changed. Then, confusion starts growing, because your silence doesn't match the pattern they expected. Eventually, those thoughts deepen into fear. The absence that once felt peaceful begins to feel unsettling. Instead of enjoying the distance, they start questioning why you haven't come back. Their mind begins filling with possibilities they never seriously considered before. Have you finally accepted that it's over? Did you truly move on with your life? Why aren't you trying harder to repair things this time? What if this is the moment they actually lost someone who genuinely cared? These are uncomfortable questions because for the first time, they are forced to face uncertainty, instead of relying on the reassurance that you would eventually return no matter what happened between you. If what you're hearing feels familiar, and it's helping you understand your own situation from a completely different perspective, take a moment to like this video. It lets me know these conversations are giving you real value and helps me continue creating content that genuinely supports people going through experiences like yours. Around this stage, you'll often notice small changes in an avoidant's behavior. Instead of openly expressing their emotions, they usually test the emotional waters in subtle ways. They might quietly watch every story you post, react to something you shared weeks ago, or casually like older photos that seem random on the surface. Sometimes they'll send a simple message like, "Hey, how have you been?" or mention that something reminded them of you. These interactions may appear casual, but they're rarely accidental. More often than not, they're careful attempts to measure whether you're still emotionally available without exposing their own vulnerability first. Those small interactions aren't necessarily signs that they're ready to rebuild the relationship. More often, they're quiet ways of checking whether you're still emotionally available. They want to know if the door remains unlocked, if they can still step back into your life without risking true emotional exposure. That's an important difference. These moments usually aren't driven by a deep desire for genuine connection. They're often driven by a need to restore the emotional certainty they once had. When you stop pursuing them, they lose the reassurance that you would always be there. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, that's deeply unsettling. They suddenly have to face a fear they spend a great deal of energy trying to avoid the possibility that someone who once cared deeply has truly let them go. It's not only the relationship they're questioning anymore, it's whether they've lost the comfort of knowing they could always come back whenever they wanted. While they're caught in that cycle of uncertainty, something equally important is unfolding inside you. At first, the silence feels almost unbearable. Your mind keeps replaying old conversations, searching for mistakes, wondering if everything could have turned out differently if you had simply sent one more message. If you lean toward anxious attachment, every part of you may feel tempted to repair the distance, break the silence, and hold the relationship together by yourself. But as the days continue, something unexpected begins to happen. Without constantly carrying the responsibility of maintaining the connection, your emotional energy slowly returns. You begin sleeping a little better, thinking more clearly, and realizing how exhausting it was to keep chasing reassurance. What once felt like rejection gradually transforms into space, where you can finally breathe without constantly waiting for someone else's attention. As that clarity grows, you begin noticing things that were difficult to see while you were emotionally invested. You recognize how much of yourself you poured into the relationship compared to what was coming back. You see the emotional imbalance more honestly. You remember all the times you managed their discomfort, excused their distance, and ignored your own needs just to keep the connection alive. Slowly, the silence stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like freedom. Instead of searching for closure from them, you begin creating it within yourself. This is where true detachment quietly develops. Not the kind that secretly hopes they'll notice your absence and come running back, but the kind where your happiness is no longer dependent on whether they finally choose you. You've already made the decision to value yourself, and that changes everything about how you respond moving forward. What's especially powerful about this stage is that, while you're becoming emotionally stronger, they're beginning to experience the consequences of the protective walls they've relied on for so long. Feelings they managed to avoid in the beginning slowly rise to the surface. Loneliness becomes more noticeable, regret quietly appears, familiar memories start replaying in their mind, often bringing a sense of nostalgia they didn't expect. They may genuinely miss the connection you shared, yet still struggle to act on those emotions. Reaching out honestly would require admitting they need someone, and for many avoidants that feels incredibly vulnerable. It challenges the identity they've built around emotional independence. So instead of expressing their feelings directly, they often stay trapped between wanting closeness and fearing everything that comes with it, creating an internal conflict they don't always know how to resolve. Eventually, many avoidants do make some form of contact again. It may arrive as a brief text, a reaction to something you posted, or a casual conversation that seems almost random. On the surface, it can look like an ordinary check-in, but underneath, they're often trying to discover whether they still have a place in your life. They're watching to see if you'll respond the way you always did before. The difference now is that you've changed. Their emotional distance no longer feels mysterious or irresistible. You understand the pattern behind it. What once seemed confusing now looks like a protective strategy, a way of avoiding emotional vulnerability while appearing self-sufficient. That understanding gives you something you may not have had before, the ability to choose your response based on reality, instead of hope, fantasy, or the version of them you wished existed. When an avoidant has genuinely spent time confronting their own emotional patterns, their return usually feels noticeably different. They don't pretend nothing happened. They acknowledge the distance they created and take responsibility for the impact it had. They may not have every answer, but they show a willingness to have difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. Their actions begin matching their words, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. On the other hand, if they return with vague messages, meaningless check-ins, or conversations that never move beyond the surface, pay attention to what that behavior is telling you. They may sincerely miss you and think about you often, but missing someone isn't the same as building a healthy relationship with them. Real connection requires emotional effort, accountability, and courage. No amount of waiting, silence, or perfect timing can create those qualities in someone who isn't ready to develop them, because this has never been about strategy. It's always been about emotional capacity. The greatest strength you discover during silence doesn't come from using it as a strategy to make someone miss you. It comes from reaching a place where you're no longer acting out of fear. When you stop reaching out because you've genuinely healed instead of trying to force a reaction, your silence carries a completely different energy. It reflects emotional independence rather than emotional withdrawal, and that shift is something an avoidant often notices more than words themselves. For some, this becomes the moment they finally confront what they've been avoiding all along. They begin recognizing the value of the connection they let slip away. They start questioning their own patterns, doing the difficult inner work, and learning that closeness doesn't automatically mean losing their freedom or identity. For others, however, the discomfort feels too overwhelming. Instead of facing it, they bury themselves in work, distractions, hobbies, or even another relationship, choosing temporary escape over genuine emotional growth. That decision isn't a reflection of your worth, it's a reflection of what they're willing or unwilling to face within themselves. No matter which path they choose, the silence eventually reveals something important for both of you. It becomes a mirror that reflects reality instead of wishful thinking. It exposes where you've grown, where they remain stuck, and what the relationship was truly built upon. So if you're living through this quiet period right now, try asking yourself a different question. Instead of wondering whether they'll eventually reach out, ask who you're becoming while they stay silent. Are you allowing this experience to help you rebuild your confidence, establish healthier boundaries, and reconnect with your own life? Or are you spending every day hoping their next message will finally prove your value? That distinction changes everything, because your healing doesn't begin when they return. It begins when your sense of worth no longer depends on whether they do. In the end, this has never been a competition over who sends the first text or who gives in first. The outcome is shaped by something much deeper than that. It's determined by who is willing to grow beyond old emotional patterns. For you, this silence has the potential to become the beginning of real freedom, stronger self-respect, and healthier relationships moving forward. For them, it becomes an unavoidable meeting with the fears and unresolved wounds they've spent years protecting themselves from. Silence doesn't destroy a meaningful connection. It simply removes the constant effort that was keeping it alive and reveals whether there was enough mutual investment for it to survive naturally. If the relationship falls apart without one person endlessly chasing it, then what you're losing isn't genuine love. You're letting go of the exhausting responsibility of carrying a relationship that depended almost entirely on your effort. And perhaps the greatest gift hidden inside this silence is that it gives you the chance to discover who you are when your life is no longer revolving around someone else's emotional availability. What makes this silence so transformative is that it removes every distraction that once kept both people from seeing the relationship clearly. When constant communication disappears, so do many of the habits that were covering the deeper emotional reality. There are no reassuring texts to temporarily calm anxiety, no small conversations to create the illusion that everything is fine, and no repeated cycle of distance followed by brief closeness to keep hope alive. Silence strips the relationship down to what actually exists beneath the surface. It exposes emotional habits that words often hide. Someone who has been doing the inner work gradually becomes more peaceful inside that quiet because they are learning to regulate themselves instead of depending on another person's attention. Someone who has been avoiding themselves, however, often experiences the opposite. The absence of distraction becomes uncomfortable because there is nothing left to hide behind except their own thoughts and emotions. This is also why emotional independence carries so much weight. It doesn't mean becoming emotionally unavailable or pretending you never cared. It means reaching a point where your emotional stability no longer rises and falls based on another person's decisions. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly they reply, whether they miss you or whether they decide to come back. Instead, your sense of security begins coming from within. Ironically, this is often the healthiest position from which any relationship can exist. Real intimacy is difficult to build when one person is constantly trying to earn love while the other is constantly trying to escape pressure. Emotional independence breaks that pattern because it replaces fear with choice. You're no longer staying because you're afraid of losing them. You're staying only if the relationship becomes something that genuinely supports both people. The silence also reveals the difference between emotional longing and emotional readiness. Many people assume that if someone misses them enough, everything will naturally work out. But missing someone and being capable of maintaining a healthy relationship are two completely different things. A person can think about you every day, replay memories, and even feel genuine sadness over losing you while still lacking the emotional tools required to build trust, communicate openly, or remain consistent. Feelings alone don't create lasting relationships. Emotional maturity does. That's why the return itself is never the most important part of the story. The real question is whether anything inside them has changed since they left. Without that internal growth, the same emotional patterns usually recreate the same painful ending, no matter how strong the feelings may still be. One of the quietest changes that happens during this process is that your attention slowly shifts away from trying to understand them and back toward understanding yourself. In the beginning, every thought revolves around their behavior, their intentions, and whether they're ever coming back. But as healing continues, your focus naturally changes. You become more interested in the kind of relationships you want, the boundaries you ignored, the emotional needs you overlooked, and the version of yourself that deserves consistency instead of uncertainty. That shift is incredibly powerful because it means your life is no longer organized around someone else's emotional availability. You're no longer waiting for another person to decide whether you deserve love. You've already decided that for yourself, and from that place, every future relationship becomes a choice rather than a rescue mission. There's another reason silence feels so significant in relationships with avoidant individuals. It interrupts the emotional rhythm that both people unknowingly became accustomed to. Many of these relationships develop a repeating cycle, where one person reaches for closeness, while the other creates distance. Over time, both people begin expecting that pattern, even if it causes pain. When the cycle suddenly stops, neither person can rely on familiar behaviors anymore. The avoidant can no longer assume that you'll eventually close the distance, and you can no longer depend on chasing as a way to reduce your anxiety. That interruption creates discomfort, but it also creates possibility. Without the old pattern constantly repeating itself, each person is finally given the opportunity to respond differently. The silence isn't creating the truth, it's simply removing the routine that kept the truth hidden beneath predictable emotional habits. Many people mistake silence as proof that nothing is happening, when in reality, some of the deepest emotional changes happen during periods where nothing is being said. Human beings naturally continue processing important relationships, even when there is no contact. Memories become clearer, conversations are replayed, emotions settle, and perspectives gradually change. Sometimes the absence of constant communication allows people to understand things they couldn't see while emotions were running high. This doesn't mean every period of silence leads to reconciliation. Sometimes it leads to acceptance instead. But both outcomes have value because they move people closer to reality. The goal isn't to force a particular ending. It's to arrive at a place where your decisions are based on clarity instead of emotional urgency. That's why silence often feels so uncomfortable at first, but becomes surprisingly valuable as time passes. Another important shift happens when you stop confusing consistency with intensity. Many people become attached to relationships that feel emotionally intense because the highs and lows create powerful emotional reactions. Every message feels exciting, every disappearance feels devastating, and every reunion feels meaningful simply because of the relief it brings. But healthy love rarely depends on emotional extremes to feel alive. It grows through consistency, reliability, honesty, and emotional safety. As you spend more time away from the constant uncertainty, your nervous system begins calming down. You start recognizing that peace isn't the absence of love. In many cases, peace is what love actually feels like when it isn't mixed with confusion, fear, or emotional unpredictability. That realization completely changes the standards you carry into future relationships. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside all of this is that genuine connection can never be sustained by effort from only one person. One person can initiate conversations, offer understanding, show patience, and create opportunities for closeness, but they cannot build intimacy alone. Emotional connection is something that must be created together. When both people are willing to communicate, reflect, and grow, the relationship becomes stronger over time. But when one person is always carrying the emotional weight, while the other remains protected behind distance, the relationship eventually becomes exhausting instead of fulfilling. Silence has a way of exposing that imbalance without anyone needing to argue about it. Once you truly see that reality, you stop asking how to make someone choose you. Instead, you begin asking whether they're capable of choosing the kind of relationship you deserve. That's the question that ultimately changes everything. If this message resonated with you and gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more insights into avoidant psychology and emotional healing.